state of Texas, whereby even though Texas has not addressed the wrongs of their past, now there are students who have filed charges saying that they want to go beyond Bakke. What they want to say is throw out all affirmative action as far as when it comes to admissions is concerned. In relationship to that, in the issue of the question of funding that you're talking about, a specific decision was just reached only about months ago came down from Washington concerning the use of the Benjamin Banneker Scholarship there in Maryland. That was a situation whereby that you had a scholarship program that's specifically designed for African American students. A person who had not subscribed themselves as being a minority decided they wanted to be able to tap into the funds. So then they reached back into their heritage and said, well, I am part Hispanic, and therefore I should have the right to that, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. I think that what it is that when it comes to address the issue of addressing the wrongs, the question is justice, what it takes for justice here in America, and that what it is, it may take extreme measures, but yet we've always taken extreme measures for whatever group we wanted to deal with. So I see no problem taking extreme measure to assure, sometime in order to assure liberty for all, or to assure equality for all.
Some folks feel what has happened in the past should stay in the past, and now we're looking at a new dawn and a new day. Well, as we wake up to this new dawn and new day, we find that I want to do this, I want to go to this school, I have the qualifications. Why shouldn't I have some affirmative action as well? Not because I am a minority, but because I'm an individual. Why and what do you say to those individuals out there who aren't minorities, who aren't women, who do not have these special race-based programs?
But everyone has, but that's a false myth. Everyone has special race-based programs as far as that's concerned. When you talk
they
about
don't define it as that.
Well, no, they don't define it as that. But when you say you have Italian scholarship, you have Jewish scholarship, you have this kind of scholarship, what is that? Labor scholarship. For a long time, blacks were not involved with labor, but there were labor scholarship. You go to the state of Pennsylvania, my God, you had the stuff there, but yet blacks could not tap into it. That's why the Philadelphia program in the plan had to be revised on the art lecture and so forth.
Well, but the issue is not that you just do it with affirmative action programs. The issue is that when you start with kids in preschool, you have to invest money in making sure that people have access to proper training, proper schooling, proper educators. You can go into a classroom today and find all the best resources and still have kids who are demeaned and who have low self-esteem. That's not an affirmative action problem. That's an educational problem. That is a systemic problem. That that isn't an affirmative action program.
Well, it's not an affirmative action program, but it is a question of race once again, whether we like it or not. We in the culture want to make ourselves feel so good and so great that we have risen above racism. We have not made it yet. Unfortunately, the same issues that you're talking about, the low self-esteem, you're talking about the educational problem. You have a school of education here in Nebraska that does not teach their teachers how to teach black children, and black children are different, and that's not an insult. Cultures are different from each other, and if your teacher is not aware of that, then you're going to ask for problems. And let's not talk about us dealing with Latino community.
Okay, so then in summing it all up in regards to education, it's not so much funding is a big issue. It's about understanding the cultures within this society that make up the society, so that educationally, when we teach Latinos, when we teach African Americans, we understand to whom we're teaching.
Right, but you can't discuss education and the whole question of affirmative action without also addressing the entire question of education across the board.
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, you can't discuss affirmative action without talking about a lot of other things as well. Fortunately, we at least are doing some dialoguing at this point.
And it's not assimilation that we want, it's acculturation that we need. Too many want us to assimilate, which means we want to be like everybody else. We want to acculturate, whereby that we still, what makes America unique is our diversity. It's not so much that we're all alike as in other cultures.
We get hung up on words.
I know, but
we need to think about people.
Well, if I can interrupt, I think the issue is a really important one when you talk about words and being hung up on them, because I think this field of discussion of affirmative action is particularly dangerous. Number one, in terms of people's abilities to use code words. They can use what sound like neutral terms when they're really spouting racist and unjust positions. That's number one.
Well, we're talking about understanding cultures now.
No, I understand. And number two, when we discuss this with people who disagree, we have to be careful to model the appropriate kind of behavior, which is we want to be able to have civil discussions. These issues bring out strong emotions and tend to make people argue in ways that are really not helpful for everyone.
Okay, let me sum this up, because what it seems to be boiling down to, unless we take the time to dialogue, we're going to run into these roadblocks that say, I don't understand you, what you're talking about. I can't see your problem. But I do want assistance in the process. So whether it be whatever element of affirmative action we are talking about, we need to bear in mind that each individual represents not only their own agenda, but their culture. So when we talk about affirmative action in education for this society, we need to take in consideration everybody, not just the individual. We'll be right back.
I think this field of discussion of affirmative action is particularly dangerous. Number one, in terms of people's abilities to use code words. They can use what sound like neutral terms when they're really spouting racist and unjust positions. That's number one.
Well, we're talking about understanding cultures now.
No, I understand. And number two, when we discuss this with people who disagree, we have to be careful to model the appropriate kind of behavior, which is we want to be able to have civil discussions. These issues bring out strong emotions and tend to make people argue in ways that are really not helpful for everyone.
Okay, let me sum this up, because what it seems to be boiling down to, unless we take the time to dialogue, we're going to run into these roadblocks that say, I don't understand you, what you're talking about. I can't see your problem. But I do want assistance in the process. So whether it be whatever element of affirmative action we are talking about, we need to bear in mind that each individual represents not only their own agenda, but their culture. So when we talk about affirmative action in education for this society, we need to take in consideration everybody, not just the individual. We'll be right back. We want to talk now about the world of work. And in the world of work, affirmative action definitely has played a major influence. We now go to our distinguished panel members, Dave Larson, Glenn Freeman, John Taylor, Carol Woods Harris. Each one of these individuals represents a significant and important part of our society. I would first like to begin with each one of you making a brief statement in regards to the positions you hold and your spin on affirmative action and the world of work. Commissioner.
Thank you. I think I'll start with just my definition of affirmative action. I've been involved with affirmative action since I wrote the first program for U.S. West in 1971. And I believe that affirmative action is not a quota program, and it does not mean hiring the unqualified, and that's always the first bit of information that comes out. It does mean what we heard earlier, leveling the playing field. It means outreach and recruiting and training and helping folks to succeed in the job. I think what we're experiencing today is that the pie has gotten a lot smaller. And folks are concerned because the jobs just aren't there, and so it's easier to look around and blame others who they feel are getting the opportunity. I could say a lot more, but I'll allow others to speak.
I'm John Taylor, Personnel Director for Douglas County. Affirmative action has become a fear word, in the employment arena, and it has been for a long period of time. And that's because of misperception, and I believe also because of an educational process that hasn't really been very well done, even in the 35 to 40 years that affirmative action has been around. And that various groups have used it as a fear word, as a negative impact, rather than a positive impact upon society as a whole. And it's been that issue still hasn't been overcome. I see affirmative action as a need that's been there for generations to improve the quality of life for all Americans and to ensure that they have equal access to the job market and for advancement in that job market. And that also includes the education and the training necessary to achieve within that market.
Freeman. I'm Glenn Freeman, former chairman of the Douglas County Republican Party, now assistant chairman of the Nebraska State Republican Party. I have problems with the affirmative action because, number one, it's wrong, it's extremely unjust, and it has created a tremendous social ill. Now, this is affirmative action whether it pertains to labor, education, what it might be. But most of all, when it comes to minorities, especially blacks, it has reinforced the stigma of inferiority, and that's what I object to most about it.
Okay. Mr. Larson.
There's already a lot to talk about. One thing that always intrigues me, I teach labor and employment law at Creighton University, and I teach employment discrimination there. And one thing that always intrigues me is that, and I think that's something that Mr. Freeman tapped into, is that when I introduce the topic of affirmative action, I get a tremendous response, and usually it's a pretty emotional one. People are often very upset about affirmative action. And I think there's a lot of misperception, as Mr. Taylor said, about affirmative action. One thing that happens is that affirmative action programs do have exaggerated impacts. For instance, if there's 500 people applying for a job, we'll just assume there's one African American and there's 499 other whites, and the African American gets the job. You now have 499 people saying, well, and there was an affirmative action program in place saying, I didn't get the job because of affirmative action, not really remembering that 498 of them wouldn't have gotten it anyway. But you have a lot of people often attributing that loss of that job to that one particular program. And I honestly do believe that a lot of whites don't recognize that there are some significant disparities still existing in the workforce. I believe that, for example, in the generation that's in law school now, that often there's many people that believe things are okay, that they're just fine. But if you look at recent Department of Labor statistics about wage gaps, for instance, in 1994, in the fourth quarter, women were earning about 76% of what men were earning as a median salary, and blacks were earning about 72%. And I suppose when we talk about affirmative action, we should always remind ourselves that it does include white women too, that they are often beneficiaries of those programs. Thirdly, it is often done poorly, or at least occasionally done poorly, because, or lazily might be a better way to do it. To run a good affirmative action program, you're doing it very carefully. You're doing it carefully enough that if you don't hire a minority candidate, you've documented why that is. And you're not doing it out of fear, and you're not doing it lazily, and you're not hiring somebody just because you believe you have to have representative numbers, because you don't. And if you don't make a particular hiring and you can demonstrate a business reason or a business necessity for that, that's a defensible hire. But I don't believe that everyone always understands that, and they might engage in hiring practices that really are motivated by fear and really, I think, a sense of just approaching it too casually. And finally, I think that there's a notion that, and this could take a lot of time, the notion that many expectations of white male workers may arguably have been forged in an atmosphere where those might not have been legitimate. The idea being, it's unfair to me, and I'm not hired because there's a program that takes something else into account as a factor that doesn't benefit me. But that ignores the fact that many of those expectations were formed in an environment, and probably unconsciously, that there's somehow something deserved here, and not a recognition that in the past, to get where somebody has gotten today, things may have happened that we wouldn't call affirmative action, but function in that respect.
Well, probably the most important thing that we need to bear in mind here, that fear will have one create all kind of misconceptions in their head. And you're talking about the world of work. When you lose your job, or when you are not given access to a job because of whatever reason, you look for one. And with affirmative action, it's a nice, easy catch. Whether it's affirmative action or not, the reason you don't have a job, you need to come up with one. Affirmative action is a nice handle. It makes it easy for you to justify your anger. What we have to deal with here is, if it's not affirmative action, what is it? How do you create, again, the level playing field in the world of work when you have one job and you have various qualified candidates?
Well, I think the point is that affirmative action has nothing to do with creating a level playing field. That's a myth. Affirmative action has to do with preferential treatment based upon race. And that's what I object to. For many years, we've often said that the fact that someone is black or fact should not be taken into consideration. Now we turn around and say we want to take into consideration the fact that we are black. It has a odor of preferential treatment, and I disagree.
Okay, so you don't call it affirmative action. You have two candidates. They're both qualified. You choose one over the other. You can call it what you want. Somebody's going to be upset.
Yeah, and I think affirmative action causes the assumption that anytime you hire a person of color, that person was less qualified, and that is not always the case. That person of color could just as well have been the very best qualified, but the perceptions and the label.
Because they are a minority or female candidate.
Well, that's the whole thing about it. See, it's demeaning.
But if you don't put the label of affirmative action
on it, whether you do or not, is the fact remains that...
I'm saying we're not putting that label on
I'm not saying you have to. The point that you consider anything other than merit, you have that same problem. And that's the point I'm saying.
Good point.
Affirmative action also takes into account creating the opportunity.
Right.
You know, for persons to be considered for positions and for persons to be considered for promotions. And that where in the past, you know, the opportunities just weren't there. It was a closed shop, and was up until 35, 40 years ago, when the exact date when the actual process began. What you're doing in affirmative action is saying that each person, whether it be a person of color, whether they be a male or they be a female, and they has the opportunity to be considered for a position if they meet the qualifications, and also for society, whether it be a company or whether it be a state or whether it be a county or whether it be someone else, or the educational system, putting in place programs that will assist people to be qualified and to meet the needs of the hiring community.
I don't think we get...
Just a second, we got a question over here.
Where we have identified that affirmative action was designed initially because of racism, and racism yet exists, I would wonder how the panel would respond to the concept of the idea that for some people that want to hide behind racism, they'll hide behind affirmative action. Use it as a scapegoat.
Affirmative action is a good excuse for people who still have beliefs that certain individuals, certain cultures, certain genders will never qualify on levels that they are.
Well, I think that goes back to what I was saying about fear and scapegoating and those kinds of things. And I'd like to respond to two comments. One is that I agree with John that we have such a short period of time and the topic's so elusive. Exactly. But affirmative action, in its purest sense, is simply opening up opportunities for qualified individuals. Now, you get a variety of things that then fall under that label of affirmative action, but in its purest sense, that's all you're trying to do. You're trying
to... Have we got to the pure sense?
And I disagree. That's not what it's about.
Have we got to the pure sense of what affirmative action is?
No, we have not. And that's the point.
Why?
Well, because of the fact you keep saying you cannot bring in opportunity. You start talking about opportunity, then you start talking about preferential treatment. Opportunity is that you are rewarded based upon your merit, and that's it.
Well,
that's it. Do you understand?
I do agree that it's opening up opportunities and making sure that you have plenty of qualified people across all lines in that pool. The Army was recently described to me as the best example of affirmative action at work, and one of the reasons that's worked is all of this the stress on making sure that there are people in the pools who are qualified and ready for those promotions as they move along. We have gotten hung up because it's poorly implemented in many cases, and because there are individuals who have chosen to treat it like a quota system, we've gotten hung up on that. And I think the immediately calling it a quota system, immediately saying unqualified, comes from individuals who are unwilling to accept affirmative action or leveling the playing field no matter what.
One other, I was just going to, because it's on the table, the notion that, and I suppose Mr. Freeman and I may disagree on that, but I'd say it's a myth of a meritocracy, that we've never had a meritocracy, and that there's all kinds of elements that enter into it that objectively wouldn't say should be part of a hiring process, and it has to do with who's your neighbor, with whom do you go to the country club. All kinds of things like that have always affected who gets jobs and who gets interviewed.
But that's not what I'm talking about. Don't confuse what I said. I said it should be based upon merit. I didn't say it should be based on whether you belong to a country club or not. There's no utopia. That's not what I said.
I won't one person can only talk at once.
Well, but here's what we're doing. See, we're trying. I'm not going to let you do it. I'm not going to let you mix apples and oranges. I didn't say anything about belonging to a country club. I didn't say anything about going to a certain church. What we are talking about is awarding a job based upon race. And I'm telling you, no one can tell me that's right. It is unjust.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Freeman. Are all job offers in the office?
Absolutely not. There's always cliques going on. But there's no utopia. And none of us in this audience here all understand this is not a perfect world. There are many disparities in this world. What I am talking about is this: for the government to sanction a program that awards contract, that awards jobs,
we're talking about the workplace.
Well, that's what I'm trying to explain. When they're finished, anything based upon race, and that's what it's wrong. That's what I'm saying. I don't care what the end result is. It's wrong. It's un-American.
Okay. What about the government offering opportunity based upon ability by individuals?
Mrs. Harris is absolutely correct. The military. I didn't really want to get into that because I didn't think most people understand.
Answer my question.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question. Yeah, opportunity is what we talk about, and Mrs. Harris is correct. The military has solved the problem.
Well, the military had the problem at first.
And they've solved. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The military has solved the problem based on equal opportunity, not preferential treatment.
I thought it was equal ability.
And I guess I'm saying that's how affirmative action is intended.
But it's not like that.
But the military is also an example where there have been a large number of persons of color and of a minority have been forced in the military because of a lack of an opportunity in the other job market.
So again, we're not living in a perfect world.
You had an influx of persons who had to go to the military in order to either get a job or to get sufficient monies for an education or to find some way to improve themselves where they were protected. And that because those programs did not exist in the private sector.
We can call it what we want, but we have to do something. Would you not all agree with that? Something needs to be done.
And I'm saying
maybe it's not affirmative action.
We should strive to make it a level playing field. And affirmative action is not the answer. Taking something away from
elements of it or the whole thing.
The idea of anything being awarded based upon race is wrong. And if that's what you're telling me, I don't care what it is. If it's wrong, if you have a job, if you have any criteria based upon race, it's absolutely wrong and it's un-American.
You raise a very good point, but I'm sure we have others who feel to the contrary.
I just want to know, what would it take then, another alternative, to make it a level playing field?
The other alternative is like the military has done. I was in the Air Force for 30 years, and to give you an example, in promotion they have 2 examinations you take. Those 2 examinations, everyone gets the same examination, they have a cutoff score, and that's that. I am saying that any business could have the same thing. What you have to understand is, and black people have to understand is, you don't become the chairman of ConAgra through affirmative action. You don't become the chairman of Nabisco through affirmative action. See, we always talk about this. The people who will succeed in this, black people who will succeed, or any minority, would have succeeded anyway. What you have once they succeed, then you say to them, you got there because of you're black or because of affirmative action. That is demeaning.
Just a point of clarification. I understand that civil rights laws are an action of government, and that's in back of us here. But we are talking about affirmative action, which is a policy adopted, a policy statement adopted by institutions. They state that they want to try to comply with civil rights laws. That is, they want to be free from bias of different kinds. I feel, as a woman, very grateful that there is this kind of expression by different entities of the desire to include people without bias. I think that the same thing is probably felt by people who are in other disadvantaged groups. That's why I think there's really not any merit to this question, to this statement that government is unfair when it implements affirmative action. It is not done primarily by government. It is done by entities. They may be universities, they may be school systems at elementary or secondary level. They can be businesses, corporations, they can be all different kinds of people. It is a statement of policy. We want to get to a better, fairer place.
And affirmative action, you said civil rights. Civil rights has nothing to do with affirmative action.
Okay, if we're talking about civil rights, Mr. Freeman, I mean, if we're not talking about civil rights, then let's not get into that subject.
I'm not getting into that, but I'm saying people have to understand that way to succeed is through constant and severe struggle. That's the way you make it, not by any gimmicks, any placebos that's handed out.
Okay, let's sum this all up, because obviously we done hit a nerve. We hit a major artery, and we need to proceed with much vigor. Like I said at the beginning, we only have so much time. And personally, I'm glad you showed up, Mr. Freeman, because you brought a side that people needed to hear. Too often, we'll sit back and we'll say, okay, and then we go home and say, good, I don't know what's going on. Thank you, sir, for your comments, because obviously, everybody don't feel that way. In the world of work, we must understand that in most cases, most people want a job to prove that they can do the job. Because if they can't, black, white, red, yellow, or green, they are out the door. Bottom line, in business, in the world of work, you don't deliver, you don't stay. But you do need the opportunity to get in and show that you can. We'll be right back. Let's now talk to our panel members. We have Dave Larson, Judy Schweikart, and Dr. Reverend Everett Reynolds. We're going to talk and discuss the element of affirmative action that deals with the business owner, the minority business owner, and the, for lack of a better word, the special treatment that business owners receive in trying to be competitive.
Okay, again, I teach labor and employment law at Creighton University. I guess I'll jump into the quick statement right now, and it's something we didn't get to, but it ties into the discussion we just finished. That's about affirmative action, not only in contracting, but also in employment. I think what we're talking about are government programs that allow, for example, the program that got all the attention was the one in Colorado that involved Adirondack contractors. And what that was that the government compensated prime contractors that would turn around and hire subcontractors that were minority subcontractors, basically. And the way the legislation was written for the affirmative action program, where the regulations were written, was that the affirmative action should be directed towards socially and economically disadvantaged. And where I think that the issue comes up is then further on, there's a presumption that if you're an ethnic or a racial minority, you are socially and economically disadvantaged. And I think that's where some of the tension comes up. And I think that's where one of the alternatives is available, and that's whether or not affirmative action maybe shouldn't be race-based or gender-based. Maybe it should be directed at the initial language of socially and economically disadvantaged. And I think there's a lot of room for discussion in that area.
We'll get to some of that.
I'm just opening that up.
Judy Schweikart, and I am currently chairman of the Board of Directors of the Transit Authority of the City of Omaha, and we currently are mandated by the federal government to meet certain goals in connection with awarding some of our contracting opportunities to disadvantaged business enterprises. And I believe all that does is just create an equal opportunity. Equal opportunity. I don't think that it particularly is evil, unjust, or wrong in any way, shape, or form. I'll give you a quick example. We contract out for accounting because we have certain accounting requirements because we get Department of Transportation funds. There's a special audit that needs to be done, and in Omaha, currently the only ones that could do it were the big 6 accounting firms. We put in our specs for the bid that they had to bring in as an active participant a disadvantaged business enterprise accountant. They did that, and now that accountant has on his resume the ability to do certain kinds of audits. There will, in the future, he will be able to bid them the same way that the big six can bid them, and I think it works.
Bottom line, though, they wonder, did he do the job?
Absolutely.
I'm Dr. Everett Reynolds, the president of the Omaha branch of the NAACP, that has long past had a very strong concern for the rights of African Americans. As I make that statement, it's clear that we're not talking about the rights of African Americans over against the disrights of others, but rather we've looked and we talk about business set-asides. One of the strongest businesses in our country is a small farmer. And this country has long past had set-asides for the small business person. What bothers us is the good old boy concept, whereby if you're not a part of the in-group, you don't get anything. We have had, many of our people have had to undergo the type of behavior that ought not ever be seen because of the color of their skin. And for persons to become a part of this great American dream, they have the opportunity to know that if I submit, it will be considered, and I can be productive in my given field. So we have contractors that now are being considered for contracts, both in terms of business in the private sector and the federal sector, that prior to this would not have even been considered. But they're being considered now, and they are doing a good job. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but I certainly feel that the set-aside program is a federal program that's long been existing, but has been closed to African Americans.
Okay. Businesses play a vital part in this country and in most cases in the world. Now that we are in this new world order, new technology is out there and we're finding out information where we're doing businesses with other countries on a regular basis. Should there be set-aside programs for foreigners that are in other countries that do business here? Or in most cases, I would tend to think they're already there. When you design working with those countries, you want to create incentives that encourages them to do business with this country. But this country and the businesses that exist now, small businesses and minority businesses, because of the affirmative action label, businesses that don't fit the category says, I would like some kind of set-aside program as well. Do you believe that that would be equitable? Would that create a level playing field? Should we create set-asides for every business out there?
If I might just address very quickly, why is there so much talk about the fear of affirmative action? You know, when we design programs to meet a need, we often find a way to build a counterbalance to that, so that each time it comes up, it'll have that counter thought. I will say to you that it is by design that a group began to create the atmosphere that whenever you hear affirmative action, what you're really hearing is racism. And do not identify with that. So they backed away from the whole concept. It is when the capturer takes on the nature of the captive, when the captive takes on the nature of the capturer, and we get a misconstruing of concepts. The affirmative action is a good program, and all it is simply saying is that for everybody, and this is the good American dream, for everybody to have an opportunity to develop themselves in America, they ought to have that opportunity. And when 83% of the decisions made are coming from one group, white males, in 1993, it's obvious that the playing field is not level. I could go on about the percents and what's happening. The numbers of people. Right now in America, we still have that the decision not only being made by the white male, and I use that term in a broader
Let's try to
sense.
keep it on the business level now.
So that when we talk about the businesses, the Fortune 500, you only have one minority in the whole bunch. So we take a look and say, who is yet controlling the businesses of America? If they're still there, so that, going back to mom and pop businesses, which are really the struggling businesses, we find it's very difficult through the NAACP to track those mom and pop businesses who can become a part of the larger stream because they're not given the opportunity. When we began to make the opportunity about 10 years ago, it took that 25 years for it to make some progress. That was when the real action came against set-asides and affirmative action, when the small minority business operators began to find out how to buy into the contracts. Now, the Denver, Colorado incident was because for the first time, a contractor got a multi-million-dollar contract.
What happened with the board in working with this new business? What were some of the processes that created a working environment?
I'm not sure I specifically understand your question. Let me tell you that our focus on the MAT board in the disadvantaged business area has also been a local option emphasis. So while Mr. Freeman may be upset that people may get things because of race, some of our things we give merely because they happen to be an Omaha business, which we believe we should support our own community. Once you make the philosophical decision that you have an obligation to go forward and go out and seek out business owners, we had no problems. The only problem we have, candidly, is finding enough small businesses that would fit in the category in order to, in fact, be able to bid on the business. And that's in all areas.
Obviously, Mr. Freeman wants to respond.
Well, not necessarily that, but I'll give you some facts, and for Mr. Reynolds and the other panel to consider. There was 77, as reported by Minority Business of Atlanta, Georgia, there was $77 billion business done by minority contractors doing business with the government. $77 billion. Out of that, how much money you think was through affirmative action? Only $7 billion. So I'm telling you that $77 billion of what was done by black companies, they own only $7 billion that was done with through affirmative action.
Is that in 1994 or 95?
The last report was 1987.
Yeah, exactly. Affirmative action's working. I wonder 10 years ago what those percentages would have been.
You know, I just think it needs to be addressed for not only Mr. Freeman but for everybody. That black companies today that make mention of the fact that we don't need affirmative action, such as out in California, the gentleman that was over the board of member of the Board of Regents that walked hand in hand with Governor Pete Wilson. It's interesting to note that he made his money under affirmative action, and after he got his, then all of a sudden he says, I don't need it. And now he's been proven because the door was open. Those companies that report that Mr. Freeman's talking about, those black companies prove themselves. And you got to remember, if you're dealing with companies in the South, you're dealing with a population base that is totally different than from most other places.
I would have wanted to have brought to you, and had I been prepared to be a member of the panel, I would have brought you our statistics from the NAACP office on contracts and on dollars. And I would say to you that, yes, we do have a larger number of blacks who are benefiting from contracts, but also point to you that when you look at the dollars, and we would say 77 million as though that's a lot of money, but this can handle trillions of dollars. And to offer me 77 million out of a trillion, you offer me a drop. That's not offering anything at all. And the question is not dollars and cents, but the question is access. We're saying that what affirmative action is doing, and needs to do and continue to do, is to provide the access for all persons, including minority persons, to have an access to the market. And the small businesses do not yet have that access because the trickle-down effect of the big boys have done so. We had debated 3 cases here in Omaha regarding minority contractors trying to do business. And the only way we got them through was the point they'd be turned over to the federal government for not having them. That's recently.
I was going to just make a general comment. One thing that I think would be helpful is to understand where we are right now in government set-aside programs, and that it was unclear for a certain period as to what would be the necessary conditions for a government set-aside program. And for a period of time it was believed that government set-aside programs would be reviewed under an intermediate constitutional standard, meaning that did it refer to an important governmental purpose and was and were our means substantially related to achieving that purpose? And the reason this has been thrust into so much conversation and so much debate is that recently in the Adirondack decision, the United States Supreme Court said in government set-aside programs, what we're going to do is we're going to give those kinds of arguably benign would be what the plaintiffs had said in that case, those kinds of programs strict scrutiny, which means the government's going to have to show a compelling governmental interest and then show that whatever they're doing to achieve that compelling governmental interest is necessary to achieving that. So the context under which we're operating right now is a pretty limited one. The government stops short of saying that the programs are fatally flawed and that will never be acceptable, but the window's pretty small. So on the one hand, if people are continuing to be very upset about those programs, well, the immediate future, they're going to be fairly limited and fairly carefully defined. And some of the anger that's been generated by poorly drafted or poorly implemented programs hopefully will disappear. And at some point, I'm going to switch there because I think that this is a real critical idea, and I think Mr. Freeman will want to talk about it, and it's the definition of who qualifies in the government set-aside programs. And I'd be interested to explore the notion that economically disadvantaged individuals should be the identifying term for who's going to participate, and recognizing all along that if you define it that way, that will have a disproportionately beneficial effect on minority populations and on women, because statistically they're lagging in terms of wages and income. So if you define it neutrally that way, it is going to have a disproportionate impact, but it's not going to have an exclusionary one, and maybe it'll diffuse some of the emotion.
I look back at what you were saying earlier about we are moving into a global economy. We are in a global economy now. And part of the business people, a part of the group of business people that are going to look at some of the foreign markets are going to look at, in Nebraska, we're an agriculturally based state. Some of our competitors and our customers are south of the border, certainly South America and even closer than that. And some of the business people that have now been able to use affirmative action to establish themselves in the business world are now going to be those outlets and the connection to those other markets, because realistically, the whole world is not predominantly white. We're going to be dealing with other cultures, other nationalities, and other countries that are going to need that aspect of a closer relationship in order to do business. We're cultivating within the business world now the people that can deliver to that. And we're also within our own communities cultivating a workforce that may have those identifiable traits and needs and skills that are going to advance us as a community. Once again, it's the benefit of the whole. But by doing some few things to help adapt our policy of accessing the resources that are out there for us to use.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap this segment up. It's business and the set-asides, and obviously we could talk about this from now on. What's important for us to understand that in this society, it's the economic environment that supports us all. And if all of us are not involved with it, then we're all going to go down the drain. We'll be right back. At this point, we want to leave you with some thoughts that the panel members have, and I would like to begin with Mr. Freeman.
Yeah, Mr. Nelson, I find it interesting that we talk about affirmative action in such a positive light. During the confirmation hearing for Justice Thomas, the critics brought up the fact that Justice Thomas was a recipient of benefit affirmative action. Now, those people criticized did not say that in a manner of saying, well, Justice Thomas was a recipient of affirmative action, therefore he's a great judge. You got to remember this. They said it in a light to demean him. So that's the point I'm trying to make. No one says that you're subject to affirmative action, therefore your end result is great. They use it as a matter of demeaning you and criticizing you.
Okay, so in your understanding of affirmative action not really benefiting those who are benefits of it, that it is more like a trap?
Absolutely. It's a stigma, yes.
Okay.
In an age right now where we're writing legislation that eliminates a portion of the population, namely immigrants, new arrivals, where we're still using race, citizen status, we're still using measurements that eliminate people from access to different possibilities and opportunities, we need a process that says that education is accessible, business opportunities are available, and the opportunity to grow is going to be protected. Without affirmative action and the reservation of those spots, those opportunities, those single pigeonholes, whatever you want to call them, those places that we can stand because we're allowed to be there and can prove what we can do while we are there without those places being protected. We're going to go back to a society that says we're not going to make use of every resource that's out there, and we're going to diminish some of the resources we should be using because we don't have a policy to protect them.
So you feel that without affirmative action, progress that has been made by women, by minorities, would not be existing today?
Not only progress, but the contribution that the future can make to the betterment of this country will not be accessed either.
As someone who has probably benefited from affirmative action, rather than low self-esteem, I think it gives me a greater opportunity to show what I can do. I don't think that women and minorities, for the most part, are involved in an informal mentoring process at any level, even in grade school, to help them access the opportunities. What it also acknowledges, which the Reverend said earlier, which I found so interesting, is that we're different. It's okay, and if we all ultimately want to get to the same place, and the means we get there may be different, but I still think it's absolutely imperative that we do it.
So our difference should be an advantage for the whole society.
It is an advantage, yes.
For America, our differences is the advantage of the whole society. Even our difference of being able not to agree is an advantage for the whole society. One thing which my colleague, Brother Freeman, stated, which I'd just like to say something about, is that, of course, as far as the hearing of Clarence Thomas was concerned, I think it should be noted that Clarence Thomas brought that on himself because, number one, he had benefited from affirmative action, and then he tried to downplay that affirmative action wasn't anything. The fact of the matter is, and no matter how much Mr. Freeman get upset, the fact of the matter is that you never should forget how you got over. Mr. Thomas and his friends seem to have forgotten that. When we talk about the military that was brought up, we seem to have forgotten that there was a president who did not like black folk, but decided that because he's president of the whole country, by the name of Harry Truman, he put it in the law that said you got to desegregate. Did the military like it? No, they didn't. The only reason why the military is the way it is, and that's what folk don't gonna get. What it is that somebody's got to be willing to open the door. Now, when you get the door open, it's up to you to to continue up the ladder. All affirmative action is saying, open the door, Richard.
But in the process of opening the door, you have to also take into account that when you do go in, don't expect everything.
But look for favoritism. Okay. Number one, what it is that the concept of making it, I heard of dealing with making it. The fact of the matter is that when I talk about making it, I'm talking about empower. In other words, I've got the final decision. Now, in the business world, so forth like that, a black may never have that, a woman may not have that final decision. However, in the scheme of things, we ought to be able to say, look what I've been able to achieve. Did I need a helping hand? Yes, I did. I take one of the greatest proponents of affirmative action, Mr. Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh would not be where he is today if somebody had not opened the door for him. His voice is not that great. You, as a matter of fact, have a greater voice than he does. However, unless you have someone to take you through that, many doors is open.
Well, then we need to get rid of the myth that affirmative action is a black thing, it's a woman thing, it's a Hispanic thing.
Right.
It's everything. To be perfectly honest.
Whoever is oppressed, affirmative action should be there to say, stop it.
Okay.
I guess I first would thank Channel 3 and the Urban League for putting on this program, because a very vital step is dialogue and coming to some common understanding of what affirmative action is. And it's only through that we identify what are the things that we can agree on that needs to be done to fine-tune it. Affirmative action has done a very good job of opening the door and presenting opportunities, and we continue to need it, and I would say let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
To Jim Nelson, to Channel 3, to the panel, to the audience, to the viewing audience, I say to you, the future of civilization depends on all of us working together. We don't need another explosion like ethnically divided Bosnia.
We're going to wrap the program up. Again, I know we just got started, but let's not let it end with this program. There's a lot that you can do and there's a lot that we all can do. And I think we made a great beginning today just talking about it. I want to thank all the panel members because everyone contributed. I want to thank all the audience members because we're all in this together. I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and watch this. Hopefully we have opened not only your mind but your hearts. Thank you.